There are a whole bunch of different narratives possible in talking about the show. Anyone who's been in the show has seen that there are some clear threads that tell a story and then some extra parts. It's a fixed group of objects from the Sharfs collection, and we had to animate it somehow and explain it and fit it in that room. And it was at once a frustration and a pleasure to do that because there was the opportunity to decide what the story might be. At the same time, spending a week with all of this stuff while installing it made me think about it in a different way than we had set it up. There were extra narratives I didn't see coming. As we unpacked the crates, some things that I had seen in digital format surprised me as remarkably beautiful when I had written them off. And some things that I thought were going to be really my best new friends in the car world ended up being kind of duds. As a result, I've spent the whole week sort of being surprised at the new ideas that smacked me in the face. And I know that I'm supposed to talk about a few things tonight. I definitely should talk about Jean and Fred Sharf and their remarkable tenacity in saving documents that would otherwise be forgotten or discarded, and then their generosity in determining a way that we can all share them and see them. That's a big part of what this show celebrates. And I also probably should talk about the narrative structure of the show so that when you walk around, it's sort of familiar and makes more sense to you. But I have faith that anyone coming to an opening night lecture is also someone who will read a label on a wall. So I'm going to just beg you to read the text on the walls because I think it does a pretty clear and succinct job of leading you through the ideas that are there in a fun way. And that frees me up to talk about something totally unrelated. Perhaps not totally unrelated. But what I'd like to talk about instead of just the contents of the show is the relationship between design and engineering. And I'm going to use the contents of the show to illustrate some thinking about that. Engineering generally exists to solve a complex problem of structure or of mechanics, and beauty isn't part of that assignment. So an engineered object might arrive at beauty, but that's not really the function. The earliest suspension bridge in Venice in the 1500s had crenellations at the top that made it a piece of architecture. And the chain bridge in Philadelphia in the 1800s had decorated brick piers. So you could argue that there was design involved, but mostly they were machines to get you across the water in a grander and longer distance way than possible before that. And what happens with engineering is that as it ages, as we've solved a technical problem and then continue to use that solution, design enters the conversation and the object becomes more beautiful. So more contemporary suspension bridges start to become sculptural. They involve conversations from the art world. You can talk about form and volume and texture and a sense of movement, and they're completely different creatures than the very same structural system from hundreds of years before. And then there's this gray zone where engineering solutions just end up being beautiful. No one tried to make them beautiful. They just did the normal trick of decorating the brick structure a little bit. And yet the Brooklyn Bridge has inspired so many artists to reinterpret its profound beauty. How does that happen? Why is the Brooklyn Bridge such an inspirational thing? Is it just the amazingness of the accomplishment? Is it the story of all the people who helped build it? Who knows? It's just arrived at a sort of a personal integrity that we still honor. And in this case, engineering arrived at beauty. This was an engineered structure. The only goal was build a suspension bridge to cross the water so we can link these two boroughs. And we arrived at beauty. As often, beauty is the first door into the conversation. This is Norman Foster's Millau Viaduct. Using what is not a brand new method of suspension bridge, it's a slight variant, but it's been used a number of times before. But by using it in repeat, there's a design element. There's a care about the art content and using an engineering solution to make something artistic and beautiful. So I found myself wondering while I was setting up this show, if these are two halves of the same coin, is engineering and design, is beauty and structure, they're related somehow. Are they flip sides of one coin? Is it an either or? Is it like a slider where you get different amounts of each? Is it an equation? And I don't know. It's a relationship of some kind. So what I'd like to do is show you some objects from the show and talk about their history and their relationship to this conversation about design and engineering. The show, Going Places, is a really lovely investigation of that gray zone where an object can be either. It can be designed and beautiful, it can be engineered and beautiful, it could be some of both. In one of the cases, there's a model of the Golden Arrow. It was one of the earliest race cars that incorporated ideas about streamlining by having a unified aluminum body, a low pointed nose, a tail fin in the middle. It has all sorts of crazy details if you look at it closely. Just so you appreciate this, the driver is very low. He's in between the double axle construction, and then you couldn't see anything. So they solved the problem by putting a scope there, and then a dot here, and you line those up and steer without ever seeing the road. So think of that, and think about the fact that Henry Seagrave managed to achieve 231 miles an hour in 1929 here in Florida at the Daytona race. This is a British speed car that achieved a really remarkable new land speed record in 1929. And you can bet that anybody in their pokey old car in 1929 wanted this, right? It's not going to get you to the supermarket in any better speed. But that idea that we had figured out how to go fast created an enthusiasm for a different kind of car. And what we saw as a result was a real transformation from a car as an object designed to be made reliably, affordably. We cared more about the system of making the car, really, than about what the car looked like. A car was an engine and a place for passengers with some rust-resistant stuff around it. And suddenly, after we started to figure out how to go fast, and after we figured out what shapes would help us go fast, those cars had to change too. The funny thing about that is that cars couldn't really go that fast. Cars went top speed 60 miles an hour. We didn't have roads that would allow faster cars. So designing a faster car and driving it on a dirt road was a poor equation. Carl Greer, who's famous for having designed the Chrysler Airflow on the right, was one of the first people to do wind tunnel testing for production cars. And he had a startling discovery, which was that most cars in 1930 would do better in a wind tunnel backwards. So the amount of drag on a standard issue car was completely wrong. It was built on an idea of construction instead of an idea of wind resistance or drag reduction. And as a result, the Airflow came out and was styled with a unibody. It used some of the form language of the speed cars of the day, but it was a complete miserable commercial failure because it didn't look the way a car should look. So we had this weird land of wanting speed but not being adventuresome. And it's really interesting to watch the auto industry try and figure out how to do that. How do we make a car look faster? We can't really make it go faster at this point, but everyone wants a faster car. So if we can't make a faster car, we could make a faster looking car. And cars start to celebrate this idea of one unified surface, of wind resistance, of covering over the wheels so that there's not increased drag. And we started to develop better metal smithing techniques for making these rounded forms. And I sort of love realizing at this point that cars start to express not what they do or what they can do, but what you want them to do. I want a car that's fast, so I'll get a car that looks fast even when it's sitting in the garage. And this story becomes even more dramatic when you look at how airplanes influence things. When Reginald Mitchell designed the Supermarine to enter the 1931 Schneider Trophy competition, he set a new world speed record of 400 miles an hour. Today, that doesn't seem that remarkable, but for centuries, we went 8 miles an hour. People walk 8 miles an hour, horses walk 8 miles an hour, trains could go faster, so we got up to 40 miles an hour as a part of daily life. But the idea that the future would allow us to go 400 miles an hour must have been electrifying. And as a result, people looked at this airplane. If this thing could go 400 miles an hour, it held the key, it held the secret magic to how other things could go 400 miles an hour. So thank heavens a car can't go 400 miles an hour. But there are some things that he did to make this plane go fast. It had to be lightweight. Weight is the enemy in an airplane, so it's very thin sheet metal. To give it strength and rigidity, they introduced these horizontal ridges. That corrugation stiffens the metal. It also reduces the drag over the surface. And then the pontoons underneath are this beautiful shape that has no decoration at all. This is a great example of engineering only. Everything about how this plane looks was created to solve a problem of going fast. And they arrived at an aesthetic the world had never seen before. Something with no decoration, no flowers carved into it, no anything, not even shiny, just whatever it had to be to go fast. And people started to apply that to other designs as a way to imply speed. There's a beautiful model of the Burlington Pioneer Zephyr in the show. It's a toy train, and it really shows you in lovely detail how beautiful that train was. And we've paired it with a video that shows its famous 1934 speed record. It was a dawn to dusk trip, 13 hours from Denver to Chicago, where it topped out at 115 miles an hour. That was so exciting that a train could go that fast. But it actually only went that fast for a moment. It averaged 77 miles an hour. That was still pretty good. Just to give you some numbers, in 1829, trains went 30 miles an hour. In 1905, they went 90 miles an hour. Not all the time, but it was possible. So very quickly in train history, we were going fast. By 1938, a train could go 126 miles an hour. So speed was possible, but the average speed of the 20th Century Limited was 56 miles an hour. If you wanted to really travel in a passenger train, 56 miles an hour. That the Burlington Zephyr could go 75 was better, but it wasn't astounding. So why was this train so famous? The enthusiasm for this train, I believe, is a result of its aesthetics. It looks fast. Trains before this were steam trains. They were heavy and black and bolted together. And this is welded, thin stainless steel, so it's shiny. They use that same trick of corrugating the metal to make the strength, but also this long horizontal band. It reflected light beautifully, so the whole thing just glistened. And it turns out it went fast, not for a whole lot of complicated reasons. They made it lighter weight. It had a diesel engine instead of a steam engine. And they removed every other set of wheels. They put a set of wheels between the cars. So each car had 1.5 set of wheels. Just those couple of changes were enough to make it go fast. The other sort of funny piece of fiction about this, and if you watch the movie you'll see it, that speed race that they did was a train that was only 4 cars long and wasn't full of passengers. It was pretty easy to go fast. Make it 10 cars long and fill it full of people and luggage, it's going to go a little bit slower. Nevertheless, as with cars, the styling of this train spoke to a desire to look like you're going fast even when you might not be. And it was not alone. There were many, many streamliners, they were called, trains that were redesigned to celebrate a diesel engine or a diesel-electric engine, but more than that, to have these horizontal bands. We call them speed whiskers, one of my favorite technical terms. And they just look beautiful, they look fast, and when they whizzed past, they were a sort of celebration of modernity in a way that older trains could never have managed. When you start to look at cars in the Going Places show, there are so many clear references to flight, to, in this case, rockets. Your Oldsmobile will be as fast as that rocket. And in case you missed the text message, we'll paint it right in there. There are, if you look carefully, lots and lots of tiny little details in the paintings of this show. Many of them are rockets or airplanes in the distance to make this association. And that story of migrating between types of transportation is really evident when cars start to compete with airplanes. When we got cars and we got parkway systems in the late 1930s, cars started to really take business away from trains. Trains had been the best way to get long distances for a very long time. Suddenly you could take your car and drive a long distance and get there pretty fast and not be constricted by a schedule or a location of a station. And trains had to catch up. That's why they were all redone in the middle of the Depression. It was worth spending the money to recapture the people who were starting to drive more. But after World War II, when airplane travel started to be a passenger opportunity, cars started to suffer. Why would you drive to California if you could fly? As a result, cars, which couldn't really go that much faster, with roads that didn't improve until the interconnected highway system in the 50s, started to get detailing from airplanes. So again, the car couldn't go fast. This 1948 Cadillac could not fly, but it was the first car to have fins in the back to suggest it might. And that was a very specific effort by Harley Earl, who was head of the styling division at GM, to reference an airplane, a twin-tailed Lockheed P-38, as a way to celebrate the idea that your car was now so fast and modern that it flew you down the highway. And what's also evident in the show is this really beautiful Tucker Madawick drawing for the Raymond Loewy office of the front end of a Studebaker. And this car is a more subtle reference to an airplane, but it's the same airplane that inspired Harley Earl. It's the Lockheed P-38. But Loewy has decided to copy the front of the airplane with the 3 pods and put them really literally right on the front of the car. But I think done in a beautiful sculptural, subtle way that they sort of disappear. But just in case you missed the reference, they proposed a hood ornament that's also an airplane. So there was sort of no detail spared to reference flight. Raymond Loewy was a very passionate and skilled car designer, and in his hands, the references to flight became sculptural, became, I think, really authoritative and beautiful. Most car designers got a little clumsy. So if you saw the cars outside tonight, they're incredible in person. They're so compelling, but they're also pretty weird. I saw I think it's the Impala there, and I knew right away that is 1959 because that was the tallest tail fins ever got. They started in 1948 to reference an airplane, and every year they got taller. Harley Earl instituted planned obsolescence in Detroit. If every year has a new car, and if every year's car is slightly racier than last year's, you stimulate the economy and people keep trading their cars in to get new ones. You can only get so tall, right, before they just fall over. So there's the 1959 Cadillac tail fin, so tall that there's room for the taillights right in the middle of it. And I love that in 1960 they got shorter, but the trade-off is the fin got shorter, but the taillights ended up in a sort of turbo rocket thing in the back. So we'll get a shorter fin, but a bigger plane reference. And just because I was curious the other day, I thought, I want a visual chart of these tail fins on Cadillacs. So I spent almost forever finding an elevation view of a red Cadillac from every year. Two, you can see, I missed the red car, I couldn't find it. But you can see they go from a little sort of gumdrop fin to these remarkably huge angular things. And then as they get shorter, the lights get wider. This is one of my favorite slides of all times. It's impossible to find process tools from industrial design. People figured out problems and solved them and threw their records away. That's another reason to celebrate the Going Places show. Every document in that room was designed to be destroyed. It was designed to communicate an idea or show a design of something that didn't exist yet and then go away. And a very small handful of them survived, so we're lucky to be able to see them. This is Raymond Loewy at a car lot in the 1950s being horrified at what Harley Earl was doing in Detroit. And he wanted pictures for reference of just how extreme the styling had become. So he needed something for scale, and his wife Viola had their dog with them. So he asked her to hold the dog up in every picture to prove that a 1959 Cadillac tailfin was taller than his poodle. And the Dagmar was bigger than the whole dog, and the tail light was as big as the poodle's head. You know, that's what designers do. You don't have the right tool handy, you invent one, even if it's your poor poodle. And this is a great slide of Raymond Loewy satisfying his frustration as only a tenacious person would. He bought a 1959 Cadillac Eldorado. There it is on the top. And he cut all the fins off and rebuilt it the way he wished it had been designed and drove that around as a sort of throwing the gauntlet down to General Motors. His daughter Laurence wrote about this. I remember visiting the metal shop with Mom and watching Dad taking a cutting torch to neuter the chrome-plated barge. He started with giant fins and didn't stop until he cut off 150 pounds of bulky chrome-plated extras. And there's the beautiful car underneath. I actually found a color picture for you because it's recently been restored and amazingly still exists. So in Loewy's hands, chrome is something that's used as a functional component. Fenders need to be chromed because they have to be rust resistant. Door trim has to be chromed for the same reason. Where weather or material change happens, you have chromed metal to extend the life of the car. He felt that the decorative aspect of a car should be sculptural. You should have the shape of a car be the exciting part. You shouldn't have to slap chrome on it. So even on the front of the car, where there are these crazy chrome shapes, they're in support of the larger sculptural expression of the steel. But that was unusual. What most of Detroit did was more and more and more chrome and crazier shapes. And that comes out of this program that I think the show, Going Places, will tell you in a vivid way, this program of show cars, concept cars, where every year the manufacturers would produce a car that was as radical as possible and put it in an auto show. GM had the Motorama shows at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, and we have video footage of some of those. They would test the public. Which features are you excited about? Which ones do you wish you had? And then they could pull those features out and put them on regular cars in slower, quieter ways. So this is a really clear reference. It's Harley Earl again with his LeSabre, copying the front of a Sabre airplane from 1947. And it's a really literal translation, right? And then add some chrome and you've got this really beautiful car. And it started a very well-remembered series of cars, the Firebird series, that were exploring how much airplane could you get in a car and still have it be a car. In this case, the answer is, 95% rocket, 5% automobile. But it's a really remarkable accomplishment in exploring that gray zone between something that was engineered to go fast and something that was designed to look fast. And what you'll see on that wall when you walk in on the right is a whole wall of concept car drawings. And they explore the entire range of what's possible. Maybe I have a sort of realistic looking car, but I just stick a lot of chrome fantasy on it. Maybe I go farther and make a really fantastic shape. Every branch of General Motors got involved in doing a concept version of the cars they already made to do the same process. This is a Centurion that has a completely acrylic roof. This is a drawing from the show that, for me, stops being tail fins of the airplane and starts being turbojet, right? There's rockets or turbojets on the side propelling your car down the highway. You'll see lots and lots of these cylindrical pod shapes infusing the 1950s car drawings. These are two cars that are not in the show, but I put them in this talk just to point out that it wasn't just GM. This show has a very high component of General Motors designs because those are the design documents that became available to the Sharfs to collect. Ford did it as well. On the top is an insane confection that looks like part airplane, part jet, part car, part go-kart. It's sort of part everything ever on wheels. And on the bottom is a car that was proposed as a gyroscopic car with two wheels, so you trust technology in the middle to keep you level, but didn't end up working, so they put a third wheel on it and just faked it. But it's the Ford Gyron, and it was shown at the 1954 motor shows. In our show is a 1955 version by Frank Paul that shows a two-wheel gyroscopic car. And I just put both in to sort of highlight the idea that when I walk through the show and see these fantasies, they seem ridiculous to me. They just seem like one person's crazy idea about a car. But all car designers were exploring these same goals of pushing the limits of what a car could become. I especially like scrutinizing these drawings, and I hope you will as well. And only today when I put this on the slide did I realize that when parked, you have to lower the training wheels so it doesn't tip over. And I just thought, what a poor solution that is, right? My super future gyro car, when stopped, must turn into the first bicycle I ever disliked. And what I start to see also is there are a couple of solutions for what happens after 1959. The fins get so extreme they can't go anywhere. So in this case, they flopped over and they became ears or sad dog. And they turn into horizontal banding on the car in a really beautiful way. So look for that as well. In exploring how to do the next most extreme thing, they let the pendulum swing back to flat, but they didn't lose the fin reference. And I also love this wall of drawings that has painted backgrounds. The future car is made more real by putting it in a real-world environment. So the clothing is believably 1960. The car and the lifestyle are some other fantasy of driving to the opera in a gull-wing future car. In this case, the fins got so heavy they just sank and became side panels. That's just tired fins being dragged along in the back. There's a wall of inside and outside explorations. What might the upholstery look like? How could we arrange the taillights? And they're all part of the same story. Even when all of the goop disappeared, when it stopped being chrome massing on top of a car and the form of the car started to win out more, there are still clear references to flight. Homer Lagasse produced 3 of the renderings in the show. He, I think, must have been a frustrated airplane designer because he's designed the car with very clear references to airplanes, and just in case you miss those, he's put a plane in the drawing. And just in case you're bored with today's planes, he's taken the trouble to design tomorrow's planes while designing tomorrow's cars. They're really fun drawings. Here's another one of a Mustang proposal and the future jet that it's simulating. There's a third wall of this story in the show, which is finished renderings of cars produced for advertisements. Remember that the documents in the show were all produced to communicate something. What will a car look like 3 years later when we finally have it on the roads? What are the components we could combine to make the car? So the first wall is all proposals for what a car might look like. The second wall is trying to imagine the world that car fits into, and then how to abstract the proposals and get them attached to real cars. And the last section would have been created because the car didn't exist to photograph, and it had to be put into ads. So another level of artistry in illustration comes in to produce these incredibly sophisticated finished drawings of cars that still didn't exist. And they're beautiful. Anyone who has ever tried to paint, watercolor or gouache or any form of paint, Look closely at these drawings. They hold up to scrutiny. And remember that it's a brush and some gouache paint, and that's it. And a whole lot of skill. When you look at them also, look at what the chrome is doing. Because one thing the chrome did was establish references to speed and faster vehicles and airplanes. But another thing it did was function as a really good way to make something read well in print. If a drawing was going to be reproduced in a magazine or a newspaper, it would not be printed well at this time. We didn't have the color printing techniques to print really clear magazine ads. So they had to sort of heighten the sense of reality by increasing the amount of shiny on a car. The way you render shiny is to put extreme lights and extreme darks right next to each other, and it makes it look reflective. So in an ad, rendering the soft, curving forms of a car wouldn't get you anywhere. If you add chrome details in the right places, you get highlights that will help you read the form of the car better. So another reason there's chrome trim on cars is to make the three-dimensional forms read from a distance in person, or especially in ads. It's also true of some of the fin conversation. When you have a sort of boxy car, it looks like a rectangle. When you add fins or stripes or headlight details, you can put those in a rectangular ad, and you get an exciting negative shape around them that activates the page in a way that helps you recognize the car more quickly. Anyone who went outside before the show, this exact car is parked outside. The 1948 Cadillac in red. It's astounding to see it in person. For me, this was astounding to see because I have the world's worst handwriting, and this is painted by hand. And so I felt even smaller when I saw it. There's an incredible technical virtuosity on view in this show. And I just want to give you a special treat because I have access to it. One of my disappointments when unpacking the show was this painting. Why would I be disappointed in this poor, poor Oldsmobile? It's lovely, right? Just gouache and a paintbrush, and yet it looks, to my eyes, indistinguishable from a color photograph. It's so accomplished. I disliked it because the version I had, the digital version that had been sent to me, had a border around it. And around this perfectly controlled painting were brush cleaning marks, where the artist had to rinse his brush out and dry it on the page, and color testing. And so that was on my digital version. And for me, it was breathtaking to see the control in the painting and the chaos around the border. Also, to see the colors, to see this pink, and go back to the painting and think, where's their pink? There's no pink in that painting. But there is. It's used as the reflective color because white would have been too bright on the taillights. So for me, it was this extra bonus that, sometimes when you're behind the scenes, it's hard work. Sometimes it's a pleasure. Getting to see the distance between the rough brush marks and the finished thing helped me appreciate the skill that went into making it. So here's another one for you. This is another beautiful painting. You wouldn't buy this Barracuda to be a race car driver. You'd buy it to feel like an off-duty race car driver, and they knew that. So this design proposal shows it as a racetrack. But it's got this wonderful loose landscape behind. It's a racetrack in the woods, I suppose. And above this one, it devolves into the border, and again, there are these great brush cleaning marks. So just keep in mind when you look at them, it's very easy to look at the work and assume that it was just easy to produce. But I think when you consider the artistic skill and really look at how are the highlights done, what is that white mark, how is it shaped, and what is it accomplishing, you'll be rewarded for your efforts. I didn't include in here one painting that, when I saw it in small form, it was a yellow, I think it's an Oldsmobile. It was interesting, but when you see it in person, every time I look at it, there's a new detail. So 2 days ago, I saw a dachshund. Then I saw that it's the story of a couple looking at the renovations on their house and the architect, and they have the plans. Then I saw the construction workers unloading plywood. Then yesterday, I noticed that the couple's son is about to get in trouble by playing on the construction site in the background. And then tonight, someone pointed out that the dachshund is trying to get under the car because there's a squirrel under the car. So any one of these paintings you could look at for a very long time, and it wouldn't disappoint you. If you look at the range from start of show to end of show, it's staggering. The Kissel styling model from 1920 and the Lincoln Futura from 1955 could not be more different versions of a car. And yet, from an engineering standpoint, they're not that different. The engine worked the same way. It was more sophisticated. There was air conditioning in the car. There was a remote control, rear view mirror. But they do the same thing. They're sort of engineered the same way. Same story with airplanes. The Junkers from 1919 and the Lockheed Starfighter from 1956 look very different. They're very different ideas about heavier than air travel. But they're not all that different. They are masked the same way. They sort of use the same forms to do the same thing. The whole airplane area is mostly models, and they're sort of fascinating because some were made as awards, some were made as desk models, some were made as demonstration models to show the airplane to prospective clients or customers, some were made as thank you gifts to the engine manufacturer, many were made for a travel agent's office because air flight was new. It wasn't until 1952 that you could fly transatlantically. People didn't know how that worked. So these were all trying to explain how these planes work to people. As a result, they're incredibly beautiful objects, but they're not designed shapes. They're engineered shapes. These planes look the way they do because they have to get 100 people up in the air, and any shape change that will allow that to happen was entertained. Where design did enter the conversation for airplanes was on the inside, and that's something the show doesn't talk about, kind of can't talk about, because it's not recorded in a real way. But if you look at the inside of the early planes, here's the Ford Trimotor from 1929 and a DC-2 from 1934, no one took care with how the insides looked or really what the experience of flying would be. Those are wicker chairs on the left, and those are upholstered metal frame chairs on the right. I promise you none of them was comfortable. I don't need to sit in them to tell you that. But this is where industrial design came into the engineering equation, because the interiors had to be designed. We had this shell that could go far and fast and high in the sky. What would it contain? What does that volume hold? This is Norman Belgetti's designing the inside of a Martin China Clipper, and he's proposing it's a lovely lounge with a floating bar that moves around so your drink comes to you. We didn't know what this tin can was supposed to hold, and all industrial designers in the 30s were hired to investigate that and make proposals. Walter Dorwin Teague designed the Boeing Straddle cruiser. He went on to design the 707, the 737, 47, 77, and 787. So Walter Dorwin Teague, from 1946 on, had a huge hand in understanding what the inside of an airplane could be. In this case, the Stratocruiser was one of the first planes to have the double barrel chamber, one room above the other, and that allowed for a wide-body plane. The structure of that shape allowed the plane to get wider without needing more support inside. It also allowed for two separate spaces. So Teague had to figure out, is that sort of bleacher seating above, rows of seating above, and a lounge below? Is it first class and coach class? Is it any number of different scenarios available in this plane? So it's a beautiful example of where structural engineering created a design problem, and the two worked together to make something. Henry Dreyfuss designed the interior of the Super Constellation in 1955 and arrived at a phrase that he used for the entire rest of his career, and I promote to all my design students, which is design should be obvious. And it came out of interviewing the people who had to use these planes. Because when he talked to customers who were flying, their frustrations were strange. They said, I don't know which way I'm facing. Which way's forward? I can't tell where I'm going. The bifold door into the bathroom, you push and get in. That's easy. But how do you get back out? My brain doesn't know that you pull on the handle in the middle. So I push and I'm locked in the bathroom. The soap dispenser, the water, I can't turn the water off once it's on. The strangest one came from the flight attendants. When he asked them, what goes wrong in flight? A number of them said, people keep putting their vacation mail in the air vents. So here's an illustration he did of Josephine, his female protagonist, mailing her vacation mail in the air slot. And the flight attendants just thought, I guess people who have enough money to travel are just stupid. When in fact, the air slot is an elongated rectangle with rounded ends. And the only other place we saw that in our world was next to the elevator in an apartment building, and it's where you put your mail, and it got posted. So people weren't stupid. There was a visual clue that was confusing. And Henry Dreyfuss realized that if designers don't plan things so that they explain what they do, if they reference some other function, you're creating a situation that won't work for people. One more very important industrial designer who is very in evidence in our show, so I thought it would be nice to show this, is Raymond Loewy, who at the end of his career designed the interiors of the Concorde and the charming but very ineffective cutlery that came with. And I put this in because this is a really great example of where engineering made this unbelievable airplane, faster than any airplane we had ever made. And yet it was so tiny inside. It was very, very small, and everyone who went in it felt like a giant or a giantess in a tiny little tin can. It was so narrow. And so he used a very sophisticated design palette of just gray and white. and created a false horizon with the divide and made a ceiling shape that became less defined and lit it indirectly, so you weren't really certain where the roof was, and you weren't really certain where the floor was, but you understood the width to be much wider than it was. And all of the upholstery is designed to have no detailing whatsoever. So nothing gives you a sense of scale, no logos, no pattern, and as a result it feels bigger and is sort of calming. And that's a really wonderful opportunity for design to sort of fix. It's not a problem engineering created, but it's a situation that would have been uncomfortable and awkward and strange, and designers could come in to do that. So this relationship between design and engineering is very rich and complicated. I learned a new word 3 weeks ago. I never heard of this, but in education now, you're supposed to provide a trigger warning when something upsetting is about to happen. So my trigger warning to you is I'm going to shift gears and show a confusing slide. When you lay out a spectrum, you have to choose where to start and stop. Do I start with the purple or do I start with the red? And do I put the purple at the other side? Has anyone had that problem? So here's my point. We tend to think of things in black and white. It's either engineering or it's design. It's one thing or it's another. Sometimes we allow ourselves to think in shades of gray. It's a little bit of this and a lot of that. It's a slider. I mentioned earlier, maybe this is a conversation about sides of a coin or a slider. For me, it's a spectrum, but there's this added problem. Where do you start and stop? Where do you define the limits of this? A spectrum could be any of these things and be correct. It doesn't matter where you start and stop. And I feel like this is true of this conversation that Going Places presents. The difference between engineering and design is very fuzzy. It's a gray zone. It's even worse than a gray zone. So if we think about ordering the stuff that's involved in the show, styling, aesthetics, marketing, engineering, function, sex appeal, glamour, the amount of chrome, the amount of legroom, it's impossible to know what order to put their importance in. I would propose that if you think about it as a sort of an endless loop, a circle, a spinning thing, not sides of a coin, but maybe the outside edge of the coin, we get a better visual model for this. Because as you get farther away from design, you get farther into engineering. As you get farther away from engineering, you get farther into design. Going Places is a celebration of this realization I had in the last 2 weeks, which is that there are sometimes multiple paths to get to the same endpoint. You know, you take the high road, I'll take the low road, but we both get there. In this case, it's not multiple paths. It's just different ways of traveling. Like you skip and I'll hop and we'll both go down the same road. I just wanted to talk more about that conversation and let you read the text panels and sort of appreciate the objects in the show and the narrative of the show, but have some other way of thinking about the really rich opportunity these objects give us to think about the world we live in and how things exist in our world. The chaos of what the Sharfs dumped in my lap, here's the objects we collected, make it make sense, has led to a whole day of every person who looks at the show saying, you know what you forgot? There's no Jeep. You know what you forgot? It's an endless list. We didn't forget those things. We had a collection we got to explain to you. So I wanted to give you some other things to think about so that you notice less what we missed and appreciate more the opportunity these wonderful objects give us, and feel with me a sort of gratitude that they've been saved. Ultimately, I sort of don't care what order these things go in. As an industrial designer, I tend to arrive at the problem an engineer has created and look for a way to fix it, or sort of problem solve more than invent. But I don't really care if it's engineering or design. Good teamwork, when you get it married to good ideas and good craftsmanship, you get really innovative man-made things. And you can't arrive at good man-made things if you don't get all of that. And the Going Places show is such a celebration of teamwork. Every car in there was designed by scores and scores of people. And when you see how many decisions are involved in making a tailpipe and a headlight arrangement, it's staggering and wonderful. It's amazing to me, frankly, that a car ever got made and put on the road when you think about what's involved. I put the Falkirk wheel up because it's an extension of what I started with, this idea of a suspension bridge being engineering, but aging into beauty. This is another example of a canal lift. It gets a boat up higher so it can continue on the water. And yet it's highly engineered. It's a very mechanical thing. And it has arrived through some crazy process of teamwork and refinement at something that I find endlessly beautiful. I put this on loop, and I would happily watch it for an hour, and every time sort of go, ooh. The Going Places show is not only a celebration of the fact that I discovered that my iPad can take panoramic pictures, and I never knew this until today. But above all, that spirit of innovation and the care and the teamwork that are really evident in every object in there, whether it's a one-person illustration of a car that someone else designed, which will confuse you on the label because there's a lot of names on these labels, or if it's one stop along the way in getting a concept car into a real car. Keep that in mind, not just the gray zone between engineering and design, but the wonderful resolution of those things that oftentimes are fighting, and in this show are working together in a beautiful way. Thank you.